Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar in our three-part Embracing Carers series. This series is brought to you by Can Do Multiple Sclerosis and EMD Serono. Tonight's webinar is going to focus on relationships and building satisfying partnerships. My name is Rachel Lottie, Programs Coordinator for Can Do MS, and I'll be your moderator this evening. Embracing Carers is an initiative led by EMD Serono in collaboration with leading caregiver organizations around the world to increase awareness and action about the often overlooked needs of caregivers. This series will include 3 webinars and 3 corresponding podcasts specifically for support partners. You can find information about upcoming webinars and podcasts on our website, cando-ms.org. If you have any technical difficulties during the call, you can contact the GoToWebinar attendee support line at 877-582-7011. This presentation is being recorded and will be archived on the Can Do MS website. We will save about 15 minutes at the end of this webinar for questions and answers. If you have a question during the presentation, you can type it into the questions chat box found in your control panel. You can also download a copy of tonight's presentation from your control panel, and we will also email you the presentation slides and the recording 24 hours after this broadcast. All right, our speakers tonight include nurse practitioner Cheryl Blaschuk from Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, and psychologist Roz Kalb from West Bath, Maine. So I'd like to turn the program over to Cheryl to see what our speakers have planned for the presentation. So Cheryl, what are our learning objectives tonight?
Well, thank you, Rachel. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this evening and also Roz, Dr. Kalb, in terms of helping being our director for our series here. So what we're going to talk about tonight is support partners and their loved ones, and kind of wrap it up with a focus on communication. So we want to understand the ways MS can impact partnerships, learn strategies to improve communication and maintain intimacy, and maintain a balanced and rewarding partnership. We want to recognize the importance of shared decision-making in key areas. So that includes MS care, life planning, household management, etc. And then also talk about some strategies for staying together and staying active as partners.
So I'm going to start us off with some polling questions just so Cheryl and I and you all know who's joined us tonight. So how many years have you been affected by MS? So we're pretty evenly distributed, from people who've only been living with MS for 5 years or less, all the way up to a group of people who've been living with it for 30 plus years. It's a pretty impressive spread, and congratulations to all of you, no matter where you are in your MS life, for joining this tonight and learning more about partnerships. So this question is just for support partners. Indicate the ways your relationship has been impacted by MS symptoms, and you can check all of the ones that apply. So I don't think this comes as a surprise to Cheryl or me or the folks that Can Do that MS symptoms can really impact all of these key areas, and we're going to try to touch on all of them tonight. So thank you for sharing that information with us. And now one more polling question. This one is for people living with MS. Indicate the ways your relationship has been impacted by MS symptoms, and you're getting confusing directions here. Please check all that apply. So again, like your partners, all of these areas seem to be affected by MS symptoms, although I noticed that fewer people say that it impacts shared decision making, and the largest group say communication and intimacy are the issues that are most impacted by MS symptoms, and we're going to absolutely spend time on both of those key issues tonight. So thank you. So Cheryl, could you now introduce Jack and Sarah for our first real world scenario?
Okay, so so the Smiths. The Smiths are a very active family, like many families in this country. Sarah is the mom, and she has multiple sclerosis. She's using a walker now. It's making it a little more difficult for her to attend some family events, particularly centered around her children. We don't know the ages of her children, but we're going to assume they're probably around school age. Jack, her husband, has been taking the kids to and from their activities. So when Sarah hasn't been able to attend her daughter's soccer games because the field is far away, and planning on getting there is just taking too much time. So our first polling question: what is preventing Sarah and Jack from attending events together? Again, check all that apply. So our big winner looks like fatigue, and that is, as we know, ever so common, and also very debilitating and challenging for both people with MS and their partners. Let's see, a close second would be distances. So again, nothing is, no answers are incorrect.
So I think this is where we're going to start to see communication playing a really essential role in all of the vignettes. But in order to help Jack and Sarah figure out how to stay active and do the things that are important to them, they're going to need to communicate with one another, with their kids, and figure out what their priorities are. What are their priorities as individuals, and what are their priorities as a family? Where's it most important for them to be able to go someplace? When do they want to be able to go, and how? Only by talking about this openly are they going to be able to come up with some solutions that will help them stay active. They really need to be open with one another about the obstacles. So if Sarah is finding that fatigue is just an overwhelming factor here, then everybody in the family has to understand the fatigue, and they have to be able to problem solve around how to do things that are important, taking that fatigue into account. If it takes a very long time to do things together, and Sarah gets frustrated, or Jack gets frustrated, or the kids get impatient, how do they deal with that in ways that are comfortable? So it's all about communicating. And then we would encourage all of them as a family to think about workarounds. And a lot of times workarounds with MS involve using other mobility options. So using a walker can be very, very helpful. I'm sure that it helps Sarah get from point A to point B. I'm sure that it helps her maintain her balance and her stability. But walking a long distance with a walker is truly exhausting. So if Sarah is already dealing with a lot of MS fatigue, and that's compounded by the exhaustion of trying to maneuver around using a walker, they might want to consider using a scooter so that the family could once again enjoy activities together. And the reason I'm talking about this right now is because we know, or I know as a psychologist, that many people struggle with the idea of transitioning to another mobility aid, even if it's just for an activity. People are afraid that if they sit down in a scooter or wheelchair, that'll be the end of walking. But in fact, mobility aids are magical. They can allow you to do the things that are important to you, and surprise, surprise, your behind doesn't actually get stuck in the seat. You can use it to travel those long distances, and then once you're at the game or at the museum or at the zoo, if you're able to stand and walk, you're free to do that. You park your scooter, you've saved the energy, and you can go on about your business. So the scooter is really a tool for the whole family, and they could decide how best to use that. And lastly, they need to do some planning so that if fatigue is a major issue for Sarah, but there's an event or an outing that's really important to them, they need to plan for that and ensure that Sarah has plenty of time to rest beforehand and rest after so that she can enjoy the events together with her family. So that's from my perspective as a mental health professional, but I'd really like to hear from Cheryl, because you have a pretty unique perspective as both a healthcare provider, a nurse practitioner, and also as a support partner for a person with MS.
Yes, that's correct. If some of you were on the previous webinar, you may know that I also have a spouse with MS who was diagnosed back in 1972. So he had MS long before we met. So we've always kind of lived with MS. So my reflections are, from both a professional and a personal perspective, which kind of sometimes gives me a unique insight. I do learn a lot from my patients, and sometimes I try to take that home too and see if I can apply it personally. So it goes both ways. So understand that relationships require time and energy. They don't just happen. Good relationships don't just bloom. Again, it's like a garden. You've got to work it, got to work the soil, and you've got to pay attention. So be aware that MS is unpredictable. We know that. One of the things that I often think about in terms of the unpredictability and dealing with patients too is just sort of predict it's going to be unpredictable, if that makes any sense. Understand that things are going to happen. It's okay. There's always a solution. I like to fix things, hence the line of work that I do. But always just understand it's going to be unpredictable, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that's going to be there. So my mantra is always let it go. If something strange happens, just work around it. Okay, it's unique for every patient, so you can't always have all the answers before you set off on an adventure and such today. Or sometimes patients will want to, particularly newer diagnosis, will want to talk to me about, well, what if this happens and this happens and this happens? There's no way to keep track of all of that. Just be reassured that you'll have the confidence and the ability to handle those situations as they come up. So understand there'll be some shifts in roles, and that's kind of expected. They can be temporary or they can be permanent. In my house, I get up on the roof and clean the gutters. I don't always like to do that, but that is my responsibility. The other thing I do is I reach out and try to find people to help where I can. So again, shifting of those roles, and that's kind of the way it goes. It's not the end of the world. My husband handles a few things at home for me when I'm at work, like makes me a salad, which I really appreciate, because I don't have time always to cook because I'm at work and coming home late. So think about your expectations. Life will throw you curveballs, and that's the reality of it. Particularly newer diagnosis. The diagnosis of MS will change things, but it'll just give you new ways to and new opportunities to figure out answers and change your expectations, and understand that it's okay to change expectations. It's not the end of time. You just have to reshift and rethink things. So, and remain flexible. My mantra is planning and punting. You can do the best and lay the best plans, and then it can all go wrong, and that's okay. Then you stop and you think about it and you punt. So a couple other things to think about related to multiple sclerosis and how it adds extra challenges to daily activities. It's straining on all members of the family, and it strains resources. That includes money, because a lot of the things that you encounter as you go through your journey with this disease process is that some things aren't always covered. Sometimes you may have to look at allocation of resources, perhaps for maybe a scooter if an insurance company doesn't cover it, etc. Things are different. There's also different ways to look at getting more resources in terms of financial. I mean, there's what they call closets. People oftentimes will sell equipment that they don't need anymore. So again, you can look at things from a different perspective. I think one of the hardest parts is the time and the emotional energy. That's just the reality of it. And all relationships require a time and energy. But I think when you're dealing with multiple sclerosis in the midst of all of it, it will also add a little bit more to that. So, and the problem with the consumption of time and energy is that it doesn't leave a lot of time and energy for relationships. Again, they're like a garden. They need to be nurtured. They need to be tended. So you just have to stop and think about, you know, what's really the most important thing, and is having more energy at perhaps the end of the day more important to my family in the long run. So,
any specific examples from your daily experience, Cheryl, that you would like to share related to these
I think,
challenges?
yeah, and I'm challenged in other ways too, because of the fact that I have a unique perspective on this because I deal with it every day, and then I come home and I deal with it too. So again, I hope I try to learn something from my patients. But one of the things that I've learned too is I've had to learn to be careful about sort of coming home as the primary breadwinner and sort of dumping on my partner. I think in any relationship that can be very challenging, but particularly when someone may have fatigue issues and such themselves. So I think what I do is try to come home, and when I'm home, I focus on my relationship with my spouse and the things that we need addressed at home, and try not to bring work stuff home. So easier said than done some days.
For all of us, right?
Yeah, for all of us.
So we're going to talk about Kelly and Jeff. Now, Kelly is a stressed out member of the sandwich generation. She's taking care of a lot of people around her, including herself. She's a support partner for her husband, Jeff, who's had MS for 12 years. And he, over that 12 years, has had increasing mobility problems, fatigue, and also depression. And while she's trying to provide support for Jeff, she's also providing the primary income and the health insurance for the family. So she has a lot of work demands in addition to the demands at home. They have 3 children, ages 10 to 16, and they both have aging parents who have some complex health issues. So at this point, Kelly is feeling that she's trying to support everybody and not doing an inadequate job with any of them. So she's feeling as though she's letting everybody down. And Kelly and Jeff have no time for each other because there's just so much going on in their lives. So what should Kelly and Jeff do first? Please select one. What should they do first to address their challenges? Well, you all must have been listening to me the last couple of times. Yes, I think everything starts with a conversation. Before Kelly and Jeff can really begin to tackle all of the pressure, and before we can get some relief for Kelly, they have to talk to each other about how they're feeling, what they need, and what priorities are important for them and their family. So, of course, I want them to begin with an honest conversation about how things are going. Sometimes that honest conversation is very hard to start. And we'll be talking about communication a little later in the program, but jumpstarting those conversations can be difficult for a whole range of reasons. And that's why it's sometimes very helpful to meet with a third party, a mental health professional, who can just help get the conversation going, help you keep your feelings in check enough that you can communicate openly and respectfully with each other, but get your needs and priorities out in the open. And, you know, establishing priorities isn't easy when you've got demands coming from so many different directions. But together, Kelly and Jeff can begin to think about what they need for themselves, and then what their children need and their parents need, and how to balance everyone's needs so that it all gets done. I think they also need to identify others who might provide some assistance. But in order to ask for help, they need to be able to identify the types of assistance they need and be as clear and specific as they possibly can when they reach out to extended family or neighbors, or they look for resources in their community that they might engage. They have to be able to be explicit about what kind of help they need. And sometimes identifying resources that are helpful just seems like a scavenger hunt. People don't know where to start, what clues to look for. That is one of the reasons that we put the Society's 1-800 number up in all of these presentations, because sometimes when you're just really pressured by demands and you feel like you're surrounded by fires you're trying to put out, a call to the Society can really help, because you can explain your situation to an MS navigator and they can help you identify the resources in your communities that can be helpful to you. So the other thing that we want Kelly and Jeff and all of our couples and partners to think about is how to look at their relationship and consider ways that they can keep it an comfortable, reassuring give and take, like Cheryl was talking about with her husband. You want to find ways to maintain balance so that each of you feels that you're giving and receiving care in your partnership, and that you're sharing the responsibilities. And that helps to keep it balanced. So Cheryl, again, from your very unique perspective, could you comment on the kinds of challenges that Kelly and Jeff are experiencing?
But some of the things I think about in terms of, again, communication and ways to look at assistance and how to balance it all. My first approach is always using a sense of humor, good or bad. I think that helps keep things in perspective. Yeah, they're going to have some rough times, but if you can keep it all, at least keep a little bit of sense of humor about it, it will help lighten the load. So stay in communication. Sometimes, personally, with my schedule, I'm leaving early in the morning and coming home late at night, and so my spouse and I don't get a chance to talk a lot. But I am the leaver of notes. I try to keep them simple, and then I usually attach them to something like the TV remote control so that I know for sure they will be seen. So simple things like that, right? So again, the other thing to think about, particularly for care partners, is that oftentimes their loved one with MS may be having some more mood or cognitive changes. And I think we noted that in this particular couple. And they can be very subtle. So it can oftentimes be simple things like, well, I told you, blah, blah, blah. So, and I've had to learn that one in particular, hence I go to notes or just kind of gentle reminders. And sometimes even with the best of reminders, things don't get done, or things don't get handled in the way you wanted them to. And then I go back to the, you have to let that go. And just keep in mind that your partner with multiple sclerosis is not necessarily doing anything intentionally. They really oftentimes can't remember, particularly when you give them a lot of tasks to do. So keep it simple and keep it direct. And if it doesn't go well, it's okay. Then you stop and regroup and maybe look at a different way to communicate, or again, talk to each other about, I like notes, I want to text, or some other way to communicate. So, and again, give yourself lots of time to accomplish this. It doesn't have to work well every time, and it's probably not going to work well every time, and that's perfectly fine. Again, then that kind of flows right into expectations. Keep them real. We're a machine, or we're human beings. We're not machines, and the world is a busy, crazy place. Technology can be both helpful and a hindrance, depending on how well it's working for you. So, so again, just keep your expectations real. Know that there'll be changes, You may have to come up with different ways to communicate just because of, again, changes in cognition. Maybe a relapse in their multiple sclerosis may get in the way of all of this, and then you'll just have to change the way you communicate. So some barriers to communications. So some things to think about. So again, that unpredictability related to MS and how that can impact couples and families. Again, it can be very unnerving. Sometimes perhaps even a couple together have, feel pretty comfortable, and I've run into this in my own personal life. We feel very, very comfortable with some aspect of our relationship, but oftentimes you bring in extended family and they have a thought about it and it shouldn't look like this. And then that becomes a little bit more of a challenge. So you just have to kind of understand that other people might have opinions on how things should roll. But if you and your partner are comfortable with it, that's great. So again, communication is a never-ending learning experience, and we try real hard to try to avoid miscommunication in terms of using like the silent treatment, because that really doesn't enhance the overall communication. Sometimes time to cool off, I think, is very important when things get tense. If someone, one of the partners is able to recognize that it's a little intense and that perhaps people need to step back before it gets, a little more intense, and then you lose the focus of what you're actually trying to accomplish. So Max and Beverly. So we're going to introduce you to another couple. We tried to mix it up a little bit and give people some different scenarios, different points in this disease. And this is a couple, Max and Beverly. Beverly was diagnosed only about 3 years ago, but at age 59. So that changes a little bit in terms of sort of getting used to this disease and how it's going to impact a person when they're first diagnosed at a later age. But her symptoms include weakness, pain, stiffness, bladder changes, and sexual changes. A lot of those changes would be present whether she had MS or not. I always say none of us are getting younger or prettier. But anyway, so you always have to take it in perspective. But again, these are the things that she's dealing with. Max, her husband and partner, has had to alter his retirement plans, which does happen. And Beverly, due to her circumstances, needed to retire from her job early and go on disability. But Beverly's become a little more negative. She's gone through some major changes in a very short time in her life with her relatively new diagnosis, and now having to retire her job. She's much more negative, irritable, and forgetful. But again, those are all common changes that occur in multiple sclerosis. So Beverly insists on seeing her neurologist alone. Again, she's kind of figuring this disease out and how she's gonna work it. But her husband's worried that she's not quite sharing all the important information with the doctor. So he would like to be included in the appointments and have a conversation with the neurologist. So again, the conflict is the independence that needs to be maintained for Beverly, but also the understanding that they do need to work as a partnership, and that also involves working with her healthcare providers and such, so that they're all on the same page. So Max is struggling with this, particularly Beverly's bad moods, and he's kind of concerned that she's maybe not communicating that, and he's worried about what the future may look like. Again, a very unpredictable time. So to a polling question, what is Max's biggest challenge at this time? Please select one. The number one is fears and the unpredictable future. Yes, I think we've talked about that repeatedly, but again, it's very unnerving. The reality of it is it's very unnerving. The other thing that came second was her mood and cognitive changes. What I like to counsel patients on, and oftentimes what I'll do in a visit with patients and their care partners, sometimes I may ask them directly to the patient, does your family like you? Do you get along with the people in your life that matter? So it's kind of maybe a more gentle way to move into that line of questioning, but keeping in mind that irritability is actually oftentimes a sign of depression. So it just doesn't mean that the person's intentionally being mean to you. They're actually oftentimes an underlying depression. And I think that's one that we forget about. We think of depression as crying, but actually irritability is the one that that I think of first when I think about depression with patients. So
So I couldn't agree with you more, Cheryl. I think Max has good reason to be concerned. His wife is not behaving the way he knows her and has known her for a long time. So he's worried. And sometimes, again, those conversations can be eased along if Beverly would be willing to go with him to see a counselor, a mental health professional, and just talk about how they're doing. And if she's not willing, I would still encourage Max to go so that he might get some helpful tips on how to start these difficult conversations with Beverly. I think, I hope that Max will encourage Beverly to talk about the mood changes she's having. As you have said, depression is very common in MS. In fact, it's one of the most common MS symptoms, and it often appears as irritability. And it's important for Beverly herself, if she's depressed, to get treatment for it, because it really feels horrible to be depressed. But in addition to that, when you're depressed, as we talked about in the first webinar in this series, when you're depressed, that makes your other MS symptoms feel worse, and it makes your cognition worse. So here's Beverly at age 59. She could be experiencing perimenopausal or menopausal changes in mood, in cognition, in all kinds of things. And if that's all compounded by her MS, getting some treatment at this time would help her feel immeasurably better, and would also help their relationship. Max definitely needs to ask her permission to speak with her doctor. I think he needs to do it from the perspective that this is impacting our lives. We need to be working together to make the best possible decisions, so that you can feel better and we can get on with our lives. He can reassure her that he doesn't need to be there for the entire visit, but he would just like to be there to learn from the doctor and make sure that all these important issues are being talked about. And the doctor can help with the conversation about shared decision making. And also, one of the big worries about the unpredictable future may be financial. And so a call to the National MS Society can get Max and Beverly a free financial planning consultation with an expert in planning for life with a disability. So it's definitely worth making that call. I think in terms of Beverly's next steps, I think it would be very helpful if she could share her concerns with Max about his coming to her appointments. What is she worried about? Why does that not feel comfortable to her? They do all kinds of things together and they talk about all kinds of things. Why is this frightening? And maybe that would help them come to a decision about these visits. She might want to consider allowing Max to have a one-on-one conversation with a neurologist if she's not comfortable being there. Beverly should definitely, with or without Max, ask her doctor about the mood and cognitive symptoms that can happen in MS so that she can understand more what might be going on with her, and also for information about changes in sexual function. If she's not comfortable asking the doctor, or the doctor doesn't seem comfortable answering questions about sexual function, which does happen, ask the nurse, they're better at it, or look to the National MS Society's website, which has lots of information about sexual function in MS. But last but not least, I think Beverly needs to be talking to somebody about all the changes and losses she's experienced. If it's hard for her to talk about with Max because she's worried about upsetting him, this is again a time when talking with a mental health professional can be very helpful, because I would bet anything that Beverly is grieving over all of these changes and losses. And in addition to maybe being depressed in addition, she needs to be able to talk through these unexpected changes in her life. Cheryl, I'm sure you have some personal
Mhm.
comments from your perspective.
You know, these are challenging topics, but open communication is important. On a personal side, because I work so closely in the disease, what I've always done is try to let my spouse take the lead in terms of a choice with me either being in a visit or not. The hard part for me is to, you know, kind of basically shut my mouth and listen nicely. It is his health issues that we're talking about, and not always necessarily my perspective. So I like to solve problems. I like to, you know, have answers. Hence, again, this is the kind of work we do. But when I'm functioning in the role of a wife, that's a different story. And again, I've had to learn when to be quiet and when to listen nicely.
Hard for wives, don't you think?
Pardon?
It's hard for wives, don't you think?
Yeah. And then again, I come from this sort of, you know, the scientific and, you know, background, and I think of studies, and I think of, you know, how this is supposed to all go. But I know I have to just kind of sit back and relax and let my spouse be the communicator of what he's, you know, what he's dealing with related to his MS. So that's a very important piece of all of this. One of the things that we've also learned as a couple is, again, my husband's incredibly independent, and I let him do whatever he kind of wants to do related to that. He rides hand cycles, and he has a adaptive motorcycle that he's developed. So I know a lot of people think, oh my goodness, but what I've learned is I have to let him be who he is. And again, you know, he's not going to be happy following what I think the rules are. So anyway, his personality, I think, has allowed him to be able to deal with this disease for over 40 years, because again, he tries not to let things bother him in terms of limits him. He's kind of just the opposite. He sort of says, I can do anything, watch me. So again, we've had to kind of balance that over the years, and good or bad, but again, keeping a good sense of humor is important. So,
You know, Cheryl, that's a great segue into the short bit we want to do about communication, because I'll bet the conversation about the adaptive motorcycle was a humdinger.
yeah, it was quite interesting.
Yeah.
That one was fun. Anyway.
So we want to spend just a few minutes talking about communication, because we keep emphasizing how important it is, but we need to spend a little time helping you figure out how to do it, how to get it started. So first of all, it's important to remember that we communicate in lots of different ways. It's not just the words we use. It's also the look on our faces, the tone of our voice, the way we touch the other person. We're communicating all the time, and we need to be aware of all of the messages that we're sending through all of these channels of communication. Effective communication isn't easy. We talk about it as though it should be a slam dunk, but I think it's actually a very difficult skill, and one that nobody spends a whole lot of time teaching us to do. We're trying to do something very complicated. We're trying to communicate in ways that accurately convey what's going on inside of us, our feelings, our ideas, our needs. And we're trying to communicate those at the same time that we're trying to respect the other person's ideas, feelings, and needs. It has to always be kind of a two-way street. We want to send clear, unambiguous messages so that the other person isn't trying to guess. This is not a game of 20 questions. This is a game of trying to communicate in the way that the other person gets it. We also want to communicate in ways that invite a response. Sometimes we can talk in ways that really discourage somebody from responding at all. We just shut them right down with our words or our look, and we don't want to do that. We want to invite a response, and we want to give that other person time to respond, even if it takes that person longer because of cognitive issues, or longer because it's not as easy for them to sort out how they feel about something. So these are very difficult things to do. If that weren't enough, there are a lot of barriers to communication. As Cheryl mentioned, life is crazy. It's busy and active. And so frequently couples find or partners find that there's just no good time. The day is suddenly gone, people are exhausted, and talking hasn't happened. Sometimes people just can't figure out how to put what's going on inside them into words. Some of us have an easier time with that than others of us, but it can be difficult to put thoughts into words. We often worry about upsetting someone we love. We don't want to say something that's going to add to their worries or their stress or make them upset. And some of the things that happen with MS or just in life are embarrassing to talk about, whether it's sexual changes or bladder or bowel issues or fatigue or cognitive changes. Sometimes people are embarrassed to try and talk about them. And none of us, with or without MS, like to spend a lot of time talking about things that are difficult or painful, so we tend to put them off and they fester inside us, so we're not bringing them up. Obviously, cognitive changes and mood changes can add extra challenge here and can get in the way of the communication. So I just want to quickly give you some tips that you can practice or think about after this. But remember that a good conversation, actually, could you go to the next slide first, please? Good communication starts with listening. If we always start with talking, we're not really being open to what's going on. So you may want to think about listening and then responding. So you want to listen actively to the other person and confirm what you've heard. Confirm that you have heard what the other person was trying to convey to you. As you're listening, pay attention to your body language. You know, if you're jabbing your finger or watching television or answering your cell phone or texting, or you're rolling your eyes, you're conveying with your body that what the other person is saying is just not very important to you. If somebody says something to you that's painful, that hurts your feelings, one of the quickest, easiest way to convey that is just say, ouch. It's a universal part of our vocabulary. Everybody gets it. Saying ouch signals to the other person that your feelings have been hurt, and it gives that other person a chance to say, well, I didn't mean to hurt you. Let me rephrase that. Or I'm sorry, that wasn't a very nice thing I just said. Let's start over. But use ouch. It's like sending up a smoke signal. It will convey a lot. When you're listening, try not to interrupt, even if the other person is taking some time to get to their point. And try not to jump to conclusions. Sometimes if your partner with MS has some cognitive issues, it may take some time for him or her to get to the end of the thought, and your tendency is to finish the sentence for them or jump in or think you know what they're going to say. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't interrupt. And if you're not sure what the person is feeling or thinking, just ask. And now, thank you. Can we go back to the tips for talking? So when you're talking, one of the first things you have to do is make sure there's time for it. A quiet time and place without a lot of distractions where you can convey the things that are important and have a real conversation. Chances are you and your partner don't have the same communication style. One of you may be more of a talker. One of you has more trouble putting thoughts into words. But remember that you have different communication styles and coping styles, and there's nothing wrong there. You're just slightly different, so you need to take that into account. Remember to use I statements if you want to make a request of somebody or you want them to do something differently. Starting with I wish, or I would like, or I would prefer is a lot better than pointing your finger and saying, you never do this the way I want you to do it. You need to get on the ball. You just put that other person on the defensive and communication can kind of grind to a halt. When you're talking, give the other person time to think about what you're saying and time to respond. Try not to overgeneralize. Every time we say something like, you never do what you are supposed to do around this house. Again, that puts the other person on the defensive, in the corner. Don't make these generalized statements that have no, that don't give the person any way to respond, unless, of course, you're saying, oh, well, you're always wonderful. Try not to drip with sarcasm. Sarcasm can be very hard to interpret. So unless you use that as part of your dry sense of humor and you guys are used to sarcasm, I would avoid it. It just hurts feelings. And most importantly, don't engage in magical thinking. No matter how much you love each other, no matter how long you've been together, no matter how solid your relationship is, you cannot read each other's minds. So when you expect that, you're setting yourself up for disappointment and you're setting the other person up for a sense of failure. So if you're a person with MS and you need help one day, say that you need help. If it's a great day and you're feeling really good, say, you know, I'm feeling pretty good today. I'd like to try and do as much independently as I can. I'll let you know when I need some help. That way your support partner doesn't have to guess and doesn't have to make mistakes, because that feels like walking on a minefield, never knowing quite what he or she is supposed to do. So now, one last thing that I think is important to know, that there are some surefire conversation stoppers. If your partner is saying something to you and you say, whatever, which we all learned from our teenagers, but it's really awful. Whatever means I don't care what you're saying. You're talking right past me. Let it go. That will end the conversation. What's the use of talking about it? Well, that means this is all so hopeless. There's no point in trying to have a conversation. Same with, I don't even know where to begin. You are so hopeless. You are such a disappointment. You are such a problem that it's not worth talking about. Or a partner who says, this is who I am, get used to it, I'm not changing. That stops the conversation. What are you supposed to do with that? Again, the you always, you never. Or if you really cared about me, you'd know when I need your help. These don't lead into productive conversations that get you where you want to go. So if you can, avoid those conversation stoppers. And so just quickly, I'd like you to jot down a note of one way you're going to try to communicate differently with your partner or other important people in your life as a result of these do's and don'ts. And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to say that, you know, there was no way we were going to get through 3 webinars in this program on caring for carers without spending a little time talking about physical intimacy, sexuality. And so, Cheryl, could you sort of wrap this up for us and fill people in on intimacy and MS?
So this is always can be a delicate subject. It can be a delicate subject amongst couples who have known each other for many, many years. But it can also be sometimes a delicate subject around even with the bringing it up with healthcare providers. So, but it can be very common. And when we talk about intimacy, we're not talking strictly about physical issues. We're also talking about all the emotional issues that are connected with that. So again, MS always kind of feels like, you know, a third party in the relationship, whether you want it there or not. It's always there, and it sort of always has to be dealt with in some way. What we try to relate to people is the understanding that it's going to change the way you think things should have went or could have went. It's just going to change it a little bit. That's okay. So you can change the rules, okay? It introduces uncertainty, again, as we've talked about, and unpredictability into everyday life. But, and it strains resources. I think these are points that we've already talked about, and emotional, financial, etc. Resources for people. And it interferes with roles and responsibilities. It changes, and people go from being care partners, and then they're asked to be more intimate with their partner. And sometimes it's difficult to change those roles. So, and it makes open communication a little more challenging at times. So some of the things related to intimacy and sexuality in multiple sclerosis, when we talk about it from a health provider standpoint, what we do is we break it down into 3 different areas called primary, secondary, and tertiary. So what does that mean? That sounds like doctor talk, doesn't it? But primary sexuality issues that you may be faced with in terms of living with MS are basically a little more physiological. So they come as a direct result of the disease process itself and its impact on the body. So decreased sexual arousal due to decreased sensory issues, etc. So that can be somewhat of an issue. Vaginal dryness, that can come with age as women pass through menopause and such, but also as a result of the disease process. Painful orgasm, believe it or not, or sex itself can often be uncomfortable and painful. Sometimes it can induce severe spasms in a person with multiple sclerosis, and that can be disrupting and concerning during actual intercourse. So, and erectile dysfunction is also, quite a common problem. That has certainly come out of the closet, and I think with medications and such, we have lots of discussion around that. So that's actually a symptom that we can usually work on fairly easy. So secondary symptoms in regards to sexual changes in MS are sort of the less direct things. And I kind of mentioned spasticity can be one. Thinking about physical activity can oftentimes induce some spasms in sort of the most inopportune time. And there's some ways that you can deal with that. Oftentimes what I'll talk to patients about is maybe thinking about taking an extra muscle relaxer or something, warm bath. Sometimes that can make people a little too fatigued, but some different ways to manage that symptom. Fatigue is huge, and I think one of the simplest things that I will suggest to patients is oftentimes thinking about setting aside time, perhaps not at the end of the day when many of us are tired and more fatigued, but actually setting aside time at an earlier part of the day for intimacy, and that may reduce your risk of the fatigue being a factor. So bladder dysfunction can be very common. And again, these issues can be, all of these issues can be addressed if you're willing to discuss them and willing to talk to perhaps a healthcare partner. So cognitive issues oftentimes, sometimes patients may be, and their care partners have to be a little more direct in terms of expressing what their needs are, because sort of subtle things that perhaps worked in the past related to your relationship and communication about your desires in terms of engaging in more intimate behavior needs to be sort of just said openly, so that planning can be done for that also. Oftentimes,
Cheryl, can I just ask a quick question before you leave the physical aspects? You mentioned painful orgasm. Does it sometimes prevent orgasm altogether for men and women when the neurological
yes,
function is impaired?
Mm-hmm. Sometimes, and that can be a challenging symptom in even other neurological diseases. But sometimes the anxiety around that, the anxiety around not wanting to relax during sexual intercourse and partake because you're so anxious about experiencing pain. So sometimes what you think you have to do is just sort of have a conversation about if orgasm's uncomfortable, then maybe there'd be other ways for partners to express their desire for each other, and that one partner doesn't need to be disappointed because the patient, their partner, isn't able to reach orgasm. Again, it's not necessarily it's sharing the time and the moments together rather than you know, here's the end product and this is what we all need to achieve. So again, that comes with that unpredictability part about related MS, and sexual intercourse may look different. And it is going to look different because of physical impairment. And that's just the reality of it. And again, whatever works for partners is a good thing. And try to maintain open communication so that those things can be expressed. So. And then the tertiary symptoms, again, we've kind of addressed a lot of these, and that involves the changes in relationships, the changes in roles, and then the change in identity. Oftentimes, a person who has MS may no longer feel like an intimate partner because they require physical care, because they have challenges remembering and functioning in the relationship, and they feel perhaps maybe more of a burden, so they don't consider themselves a sexual partner. One of the other things I just pointed out in looking at this sort of grouping of how we kind of break up intimacy and sexual issues in MS, the primary and secondary issues can oftentimes be addressed with the healthcare provider, but the tertiary issues related to the change in relationships will oftentimes require, you know, expertise of perhaps a mental health provider or counselor, and just a lot more time actually to reflect on those changes and what they all mean. So, okay, next slide. So caring in sexuality starts with open communication and a willingness to change behaviors. Again, the way it was when you were 20 is going to be different as you move through the life stages, just in normal aging as we all get a little bit older, but also in terms of dealing with the disease process too. It's just another aspect to how we change the way we relate to a partner. So again, switching and changing of roles, which is often very, very challenging, but again, try to keep open, an open mind, and approach it as such. Allowing time away from caregiving, which is oftentimes challenging. I personally suffer from, you know, sometimes having a little too much caring because I do it for a living. I mean, I do it all the time. So for me, sometimes I have to step away from, I'm not going to be a caregiver right now, because otherwise it can lead to some resentment, and you don't want that in the relationship. So, and again, keeping intimacy and sexual activities separate from caregiving. It may be as simple as saying, we're done, and now we're just going to be together. Just trying to kind of separate those activities. So, easier said than done. But again, just keep in mind that there's not a wrong way to have a discussion in terms of an open discussion. So what is the most important organ in sex? And this is my favorite. So next, it's the brain. So I love neurology, and the thing to think about is that sex is not about for lack of better words, penis and vaginas. It's actually more about the brain and connecting with people on an intimate level. So keep that in mind. We need to think about managing multiple sclerosis as a team. This is one of my favorite photos I found online, and it kind of reminds me of my spouse and I, because he generally is about 20 feet ahead of me in the chair, because he can move much faster than I can. So, but it's okay. You know, we just need to work as a team. Again, I try to let him be as independent as possible. Sometimes it leaves me in the dust, but that's okay. I've got the bags. I'm coming up the back, but it'll be fine. So anyway, so just understand that it's okay to manage it as a team, and as long as both partners are agreeable that you know, this is the way to go, it's okay. So.
Thank you so much for sharing so much of your personal experiences, Cheryl. I think that helped all of us. The key takeaways that we want you to have from tonight are about the importance of building and maintaining your communication. We hope we gave you some tips for that. How important it is to share in key decisions that affect all the aspects of your life so that you can maintain a good, effective, and comfortable balance in your relationship. Building a support network so that you're getting support from those around you is incredibly important, as well as finding the resources in your community that you need to help you do what you want to do. Plan for the future. My favorite takeaway is, you know, you plan for the worst at the same time that you're hoping for the best, because planning for the worst will always keep you better prepared no matter what comes your way. And as Cheryl has so nicely pointed out last webinar and this webinar, maintaining your sense of humor is critical to dealing with the challenges of a chronic illness like MS. So we thank all of you for being with us for these 3 webinars. Rachel, are you there?
All right. Yes, I am here. And thank you both to Roz and Cheryl for providing their expertise and experience. We do have time for a few questions before we wrap up for the night. So first question, how do I find easy ways to bring joy and fun back into our MS-driven relationship? And Roz, do you want to start off with that one?
Sure, and I think the most important thing is to remember that it's okay to do things differently. If you find that you're gradually giving up this activity and this hobby and that outing because you can't do them the way you used to do them, you pretty soon find your life space shrinking to just about nothing, and it's not much fun. But when you work with your healthcare team to manage symptoms and you work with the rehab team to identify tools and mobility options that can help you stay active, you suddenly can find that many things you gave up you still can do, and you might even discover some new things you never tried before that are fun to do together.
Great. And Cheryl, any feedback?
Yeah, I agree with that. One of the things too to keep in mind is if you're finding that you're becoming more and more limited in activities and such, it's okay to talk to your healthcare provider. I'm very blessed that I work in an academic medical center and I have lots of resources. If I can't handle it, I've got an ologist that I can refer you to, who can talk to you about different aspects and ways to manage maybe bladder issues and bowel issues and how those things can create anxiety with going out and, you know, getting around in the world. So again, I refer to physical medicine and neurology, and I also have, in terms of back to the sexuality questions and concerns, I have, you know, a women's health specialist, and we have a clinic and such related to women's health and looking at sexual dysfunction. So I have experts in that area too.
Great. All right, great suggestions. Thank you. So next question, my spouse, who's also my support partner, he's not willing to listen or read any information on MS. So how can I convey to him how much it hurts that I feel alone in my MS? So Roz, would you want to start with that?
Well, I think it starts by expressing that, and again, using I statements. I'm feeling very alone in this. I'm missing your support and your understanding. I'm wondering whether there's something very frightening about all of this that you really don't want to talk about. Could I give you some things? You don't have to read them with me, but would you be willing to take a look? Because I can't do this by myself. I really need your love and support. How can I make that easier for you to provide to me?
Okay. And Cheryl, anything from your experience?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Roz in terms of, I think that just simply stating it, and again, a very open manner to start to stimulate a conversation. People come to different points in managing this disease at different times. Sometimes, oftentimes maybe the care partner is very gung-ho and wants to learn and wants to be a good support person, and perhaps the person dealing with the disease process is just kind of getting over some denial and needs some more time to absorb the changes that are coming or the changes that they've dealt with so far. So again, opening up that conversation and understanding that it's okay, because people do reach different points in the disease process at different times. But again, just a simple, can we talk about this? And a compromise is probably the best way to approach that.
Wonderful, great suggestions. So this next question, my husband wants us to travel the world and participate in athletic activities, and I'm unable to do so. So how can we plan for our future together when it looks so different for both of us? And Cheryl, maybe if you want to start with that one.
Well, there are lots of options for travel. I subscribe obviously and get some of the publications to the National MS Society. I think it's Momentum, and they often will highlight travel agencies that will specialize in helping people who are dealing with handicap type of needs during travel. So sometimes just a little planning might be very helpful in terms of being able to do different activities on vacations and such. That's okay. Perhaps the person with MS becomes more of an athletic supporter than the athlete themselves. But again, just the fact of that they're physically within the same sort of arena, and maybe one person is actively participating in competitive sport and the other person is cheering them on. That still is being together and doing it. Everybody doesn't have to run the race and win it. You can be there and cheer them on, and there's nothing wrong with that.
That's great. And Roz, anything from you?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly suggest going to the National MS Society website and just putting travel into the search engine, and you will find an incredible number of resources to help you think about what kinds of travel you might want to do, what shared opportunities there are. There's just an abundance of resources. And also, I think this is where the rehab team are the magicians. If you talk to a physical or occupational therapist about the different physical activities or travel activities that you might want to try to experiment with together, they're the ones who can talk to you about the tools you can use to do it, or the adaptive equipment, adaptive sporting opportunities, and there are several excellent webinars archived on the Can Do website, one specifically about travel and a few that have to do with adaptive activities that you can think about engaging in together. But I also want to reinforce what Cheryl said about you can do lots of things together, but it doesn't mean you have to do every single thing together or do it the same way. You can still enjoy each other's company. It doesn't mean one of you is out and about and the other is staying home all the time. There are lots of ways to experiment with new and different activities.
Love it. So time for one last question. So my significant other has severe progressive MS and many physical and cognitive challenges. I'm proud to be his carer as well as his partner, but he's come to take me for granted and even admits he takes advantage, causing me to be resentful and not always kind. So it didn't used to be like this. We're equally responsible for this decline, but how can we reach the balance where each of us gives and receives care with grace, without anger, and with love? So Roz, would you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a magic solution for every couple with or without MS that I've ever known, that we care for each other with grace and humor and respect and charm. I think that it sounds as though you settled into a pattern that's not really comfortable for each of you, and somehow you recognize that it's gotten to a not very good place. This is an ideal time to sit down with a mental health professional or a counselor who's familiar with MS or chronic illness and just talk about how you perceive your relationship, how you think it's changed, and begin to explore together some strategies you might use to get it back on track. This is not going to be something that gets solved overnight. It's a process of working toward a shared goal of getting your relationship to a place that it feels more comfortable and satisfying for both of you.
And Cheryl, anything from your personal experience?
Yeah, it is. It's that is a big challenge, and accept the fact that there will be times, like Roz said, that you kind of settle into sort of comfortable roles, and then all of a sudden you realize that perhaps they're a little pathological, and that both people involved are not able to are perhaps feeling some resentment. So understand that it can happen, but you can also change it. I think trying to keep an open mind on that and not beat yourself up because you've fallen into these patterns. Anything can change, and with just some work and commitment, you can get back to perhaps a little more evenness in the relationship.
All right. So that's all the time we had tonight for our presentation. So I just wanted to thank Roz and Cheryl for being a part of this, sharing their knowledge and expertise again. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks to all of you viewers.
All right, and before we end the session, I would just like to remind you about some resources available. So if you want to find more information about this topic, the National MS Society has a variety of brochures and video segments for caregivers that can be accessed on their website, nationalmssociety.org. We also talked about the National MS Navigators. So here's their information again. Make sure you keep this on hand. It's not only for the person with MS, but support partners too. So reach out if you are looking for resources. And Can Do MS also has some great resources on our website, cando-ms.org, where you'll find archived webinars, Can Do on demand, and library articles. You can also submit a question to ask the Can Do team, which will be answered by our team of MS experts. So our next presentation in our regular webinar series will be on Tuesday, November 13th at the same time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will cover the topic, Communicating About Tough Topics, Caring for Others While Caring for Yourself. And for those participating live tonight, you'll see a survey appear on your computer screen. Please take a moment to complete and share your input. Your feedback really helps us improve these webinars. So thank you all again for joining us tonight, and I hope you have a great evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.